The first subway in America was built in Boston. 1897 it started. Subway was built during the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. The country was changing over from a farming community over to a business community. And it was very much a product of technological changes that made during that time. The Encyclopedia of 20th Century Architecture said the subway is a 19th century idea realized largely on the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution was the primary catalyst for the advent of underground transportation. Without it, the iron horse that pulled the trains, the tunneling technology that bored through the earth, and the iron walls that held these tunnels up would have been impossible. And the Boston subway only came about due to the specific invention of electric motors in the late 19th century. The first underground subway was in London, and they used gasoline to run the vehicles. So that the area was filled with soot and smoke and so forth, and the Americans thought that there's a better idea. Since Americans were not keen on the idea of a subway like the one in London, which was a steam train that ran in dark channels, spewed ash and soot everywhere, an alternative method of generating power would be needed to build a subway in the U.S. Fortunately, an American inventor, Frank Sprague, solved this problem when he invented the electric motor in 1886. After Sprague successfully installed his motor in trolleys in Richmond, Virginia, it prompted Henry Whitney, the owner of the West End Railway in Boston, to upgrade his trolleys to run on electricity the following year. They had the trolleys in Boston had started out horse-drawn, and then they went over to gasoline, and then they decided to experiment with clean energy. The experiment with clean energy is what later made it possible to convince lawmakers, businessmen, and the general public that it was feasible to run these electric trolleys underground in Boston. At the time, Boston had a significant problem with congestion in the streets due to overcrowding issues and frequent blizzards and storms clogging up the city's small, winding, colonial area streets. And you see here what it was like at any instant of all the trades, the subway cars that were blocking the area there. This is when the construction started. You see the construction to the middle of the photo there. But these trains, they ran 200 trains a day, which really confused the traffic area, because you also had automobiles, just the early automobiles running. You had these electric cars running. You also had horses in traffic and carrying wagons throughout the area of Boston. So it really got to be a lot of congestion and blocking everything. That's why they really wanted to go underground if possible. The street congestion became such a problem that city officials began barnstorming ways to alleviate it. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers website, by the 1890s, the transportation infrastructure of downtown Boston, a maze of narrow, winding streets laid out, in some cases, along Colonial Cow Pass, proved completely inadequate for the methods of a modern, bustling metropolis. Tremont Street, the city's main thoroughfare, was regularly subjected to gridlock from a convergence of foot traffic, horse-drawn conveyances, trolley lines, and electric streetcars. To rectify the problem, the Boston Transit Commission, with Howard A. Carson as the chief engineer, was created in 1894 to study remedies. Contributing to the congestion problem was the recent influx of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe. According to the book Beneath the Streets of Boston, Boston's traffic problems surfaced during the 1890s, but their roots stretch back half-century to the years when the city's population truly began to explode. During the 1840s, Boston was the first stop in the New World for thousands of desperate and hungry immigrants fleeing Ireland's disastrous potato famine. A steady stream of immigrants from Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe added to the numbers, and in just 10 years, Boston population swelled from 90,000 people to 135,000 people. Public transportation at the time was practically non-existent, so city officials began creating horse-drawn trolleys, which were later replaced by electric trolleys to accumulate the growing population. These trolleys continued with pedestrian traffic, private horse-drawn carriages, and cabs, as well as commercial wagons, created daily traffic jams in the streets. City officials felt the best solution to this problem was to build an underground subway, and promptly began to lay the groundwork for a new transit system. They got the idea primarily from London. London had developed a subway. Paris was building one, and one of the Eastern European nations was building one at the same time, but London was the only one that existed before the U.S. Since building a subway underneath the streets involved a lot of red tape, in 1891 the City Council authorized the formation of the Rapid Transit Committee, and the state legislature passed an act allowing for the formation of a committee to promote rapid transit in the city. The organization had 8 members, the Rapid Transit Commission. Some of the members went abroad to England, Germany, and France to study transportation methods there, and after 9 months of study, filed a report to the city officials in April of 1892, recommending a number of projects. One of the projects they recommended was a small-scale subway located in the most congested areas between Tremont Street, Boylston Street, and Scully Square. The plan for the subway was to link the underground subway tracks with the existing street tracks of the West End Street Railway in South and West Boston, and the street tracks of the Lynn and Boston subway on to the north of Boston. This would allow the subway to run on the surface streets in less congested areas and underground in the most congested areas to reduce street traffic above. In 1893, the legislature passed 2 acts. The first act called for the formation of a Metropolitan Transit Commission and was promptly rejected by the voters at the state election. The second act allowed the formation of a board of subway commissioners that was authorized to lay out and correct a subway from Tremont Street to Pleasant Street. The act was approved by the Boston City Council on January 1st, 1894. In 1894, the legislature passed an act which allowed for the transportation of Boston Elevated Railway, a privately owned company that would be responsible for building and running an elevated railway line, was also called for the creation of the Boston Transit Commission, which was the first public transportation agency in America. The commission was authorized to build a number of subway lines according to the Special Publications periodical. The commission was authorized but not required to construct a subway or subways of sufficient size for 4 railway tracks through and under Tremont Street and the adjoining Mall of Boston Common from a point near the junction of Tremont Street and Sherman Avenue to Scully Square and thence to Conway Street. A second plan was a subway of sufficient width for 2 tracks only from Tremont Street and through and under Boylston Street and the adjoining Mall of Boston Common to a point on Boston Street where suitable connections with the surface track could be made, and from Boston Street through and under Park Square and Columbus Avenue to a point on Columbus Avenue where a suitable connection to surface traffic could be made there. The third was a subway from Tremont Street through and under Park Street, Temple Street, and Stanford Street to Merrimack Square. And fourth, a tunnel from a point or near Scully Square to a point on or near Maverick Square in East Boston. They were also required to construct a bridge to Charlestown, and you see that bridge today going across the river. The act further authorized the issue of bonds to the amount of $7 million for the construction of subway and a sufficient sum in addition to the $750,000 already appropriated by the City Council to complete the bridge. The act was approved on July 2, 1894, and was accepted by the voters of Boston in a special election held in July of 1894. While planning the layout of the Boston subway, the Boston Transit Commission became aware of parts of the central burying ground near Boylston Street, possibly lay in the path of the subway. The commission asked Dr. Samuel Green, the former mayor of Boston and a librarian for the Massachusetts Historical Society, to write a report about the history of that plot of land and to ask for advice as what to do with the remaining unearthed ground. In addition, the commission also asked Green if there was any health risk involved in unearthing dead bodies. Green submitted the following report on December 20th, 1894. The parcel of land was bought by the town in the year 1756 for a place of interment, and since then it has continued to be used for that object. The first burials were made in graves, and so far as now can be ascertained, the earliest tombs were built about 1793. Some years later, Frog Lane was widened and became Boylston Street, as it's known today. In the 1836 Boylston Street Mall was laid out, and in order to strengthen the path, the mall was raised and carried over a line of tombs which stood in the way. At this time, some of the tombs were emptied by the contents of the owners, while others were filled up, the remains being taken either to new tombs built on the westerly side of the ground or to other cemeteries, or were covered up, where it was supposed that they would lie undisturbed until they were completely decomposed and mingled with the surrounding soil. There was some reason to think that when the burying ground in question was first used as such, a few of the interments were made outside the present limits of the common, presumably where the street now runs. Within the past few weeks, Boston Stride Boston Street on its north side near the fence had been dug up by the Boston Electric Light Company, and I am told that credible versions of fragments of human skulls and other bones were thrown out by the workmen. It is possible, of course, that these remains came originally from the common and were scattered when the earth either when Boylston Street was graded or when the mall was laid out. A subterranean passage of tunnel under the mall along the southern border of the common would probably disturb the bones of many an old Bostonian, but this cannot be helped. At the present time, the question is a practical one. If the proposed plan for a subway is carried out, and the removal of the remains becomes a necessity, then all rights in those hidden tombs on the part of their former owners have long since been extinguished, and no injustice would be done to the living representatives of the 7 families by a reburial of the remains. It goes without saying that such action, under the guidance of your board, would be decently and respectably done. With that end in view, I would recommend that all such traces of the human body as may be found in these excavations should be carefully gathered up and placed in proper receptacles for their interment in the same burying ground where presumably repose the ashes of the kindred, and that this suggestion be carried out with the same regard for the feeling of friends, so far as practicable under existing conditions, as was shown in the original burial, and if each bony fragment was now fully identified with the person who it formerly belonged. In regard to your question regarding risk from infection or contagion as a result of the lost illness of the descendants, I would say there would be no danger whatever to the workmen. The earth is a good disinfectant, and a burial of more than half a century would wipe out and destroy any germs of disease that might still linger after death. That was from the investigator. Another obstacle the commission faced was a number of private properties that lay in the path of the proposed subway lines. In order to overcome these obstacles, these private properties were seized by the cities. Some of the properties include a large block of property bound by Haymarket Square, Canal Street, Causeway Street, and Haverhill Street, and another block of property bound by Sherman Avenue, Pleasant Street, Tremont Street, and Warrington Street. A block of land between Canal and Haverhill Streets that was owned by the Boston and Maine Railroad was taken by the city in 1894, and the company was awarded $750,000 in damages for the seizure. A block of land bound by Sherman Avenue, Pleasant Street, Tremont Street, Warrington Street that consisted of 3 private estates were taken by the city in 1894, and the city paid $348,427 for damages. According to testimony given by George G. Crockett, who was chairman of the Boston Transit Commission, to the members of the British Parliament in October 1903, when Britain was considering building an elevated railway in London, sought the advice of the Boston Transit Commission, the initial reaction to this idea of a subway in Boston was negative. The act which, it is his statement from Crocker, the act which authorized us to build it did not compel us to build it, and when we decided to build it, there was a great public uproar and meetings in Faneuil Hall, and the legislature came very near to repealing the act. The newspapers were against us. The steam railwaymen smiled at the idea, and the West End Street Railway Company, which was then operating all these lines of the city, said, "Very well, you can go ahead and build it. We will never be willing to pay anything for it. The legislature may oblige us to use it, but we can never afford to pay anything for it. But when we got about half completed, the West End Railway began to negotiate it for a lease of it. Opposition was so strong that over 12,000 businessmen signed a petition against the construction of the subway, and an anti-subway league was formed. Some members of the public were also skeptical about the idea of traveling underground because it was a place associated with death and burial. This was a constant theme during the entire line of the project. It didn't help when the construction later unearthed the graves from the central burying ground. Many people believed that air quality underground was poor, and the people would become sick for breathing in the air. Some residents complained during construction that the work was poisoning the air and killing the trees in public garden. According to the article in the Daily Advertiser in the summer of 1895, some of them have died. Why should this foul, poisonous sod be laid out in the city parks to perfume the neighborhood and spread disease germs over the surrounding regions? These complaints were few, and opponents of the project were viewed by the general public as backwards and old-fashioned people who stood in the way of progress. On March 28, 1895, the chairman of the commission of the Massachusetts governor, Frederick G. Greenedge, Boston Trans Commission George C. Crocker, and other members of the commission broke ground on the project in a special ceremony in the Boston Public Garden. The construction process first called for a large 2,300-pound pile driver to hammer the ground and loosen the dirt so that workers could shovel it into carts and cart it away. Then the engineers could combine two different types of construction to build the tunnel: the underground tube style of construction used in London, and a newer open evacuation method used in Paris. In order to keep Tremont Street open during the day as required by the Act of 1894, the Commission combined these two techniques to create their own construction technique, which became known as the cut and cover technique. In this technique, trenches were dug along sections about 10 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. Wood braces were installed to prevent the dirt from caving in, and were placed across the top of the trench to support a roof for bricks to be laid. Workers continued to dig the trench deeper, and once it was deep enough, steel support beams were placed on the sides of the walls and along the top, perpendicular to the tracks. Workers then built the walls and floors with concrete, reinforced by steel beams, and added waterproof grout. Masons and steel workers then constructed the roof of the tunnel by building brick arches between the steel support beams and finishing up the surface with a layer of concrete and soil. Boylston and Park Street were built with rectangular stone head houses, designed by Edmund Wheelwright. It did not aesthetically match the Common, Scully Square, and Adams Square. They had similar Baroque head houses with four-sided clock towers. Unlike the interior decor, the head houses were simply criticized as resembling museum and potential monumental. Later stations in the East Boston Tunnel and Washington Street incorporated the criticism into more modest head houses. Head houses were the entranceways into the subway. The cut and cover technique was so successful that there were very many little interruption to the street traffic above. The technique later became a standard practice in nearly all American subway construction. According to Crocker, the chairman of the Boston Transit Commission, in his testimony to Parliament in England, building the subway areas in Boston built on a landfill was especially difficult and caused slight damages to the foundations of nearby buildings. We did some injury, but it was slight. Construction was specifically difficult from Adams Square north that all filled or made land. Nearly all the buildings are built on piles, and they were built many years ago. The piles of all varieties and all lengths, some short, some long, and our subway in that part of Washington Street, being 4 tracks, occupied practically the whole width of the street. There was one place up Tremont Street where the building was slightly cracked, but the actual work of repairing damages to the building was less than $1,000. In addition, about a month into construction on April 18, 1895, workers uncovered human remains under Boylston Street, such as Dr. Green had predicted they would. According to the book, A City So Grand, The Rise of the American Metropolis, Boston 1850 to 1900, the bones were originally discovered by college students exploring the construction site. And when the workers began collecting the bones and piling up on a retaining wall near the construction site in plain view of passersby, word began to spread. The first human remains were discovered 24 hours earlier when a medical student poking around the construction had stepped on something hard that gave way with a loud snap. Believing he had broken a stick, the student had scratched away some dirt with his boot, reached down, and picked up the object, only to find it was a human thigh bone. Moments later, other students found a skull, the disjointed parts of 2 arms and hands, the crumbling bits of bone scattered in the area. Things had deteriorated from there. Workers unearthed additional bones and began piling them carefully against a retaining fence adjacent to Boyle Street on the southwest entrance of the common. Passersby watching the construction had blanched at the sight of spreading word of the grisly discovery. In the evening, vandals had entered the unguarded open tomb, removed human remains, and paraded around the common, led by one grinning youth holding aloft a skull as the others followed. Neighbors finally contacted the police, who put a stop to the demonstration. That was from the book, A City So Grand. As Dr. Green previously predicted, the remains from the central burying ground, the edge of Bryant Common, when the street was widened in 1836, Green suspected that workers built the road over the bodies instead of reinterring somewhere else. The day after the discovery, the commission contacted Dr. Green to take control of the newly discovered remains, according to a report by Dr. Samuel Green on July 27th. On April 19th, my attention was first called to the discovery of various parts of several skeletons were found during the forenoon of that day or the afternoon of the preceding day, lying outside the tombs. Steps were taken at once for the proper care of these fragments, and boxes were ordered for their final disposition. Apparently the bodies had been placed originally in the ground, though there was hardly any trace of coffins, and it would seem probable that many of these bones had been previously disturbed. The incident was but the beginning of this discovery of other remains, which continued daily in considerable numbers for several weeks. The various parts of the skeleton were so incomplete that it is impossible now to say with any exactness how many different persons they represented, but an approximation of the number is given later in this report. In some cases, the fragments were very small, and if found elsewhere would not have been recognized as belonging to the human frame. The special duty of collecting these remains was assigned by the contractors to 2 or 3 men who I am satisfied did their work faithfully, and whenever practical, they placed the bones of one body in a single box, in 2 instances the Sole, the Lowell, and the Tunnel tombs, where the remains and tombs were identified and were taken by representatives of the 2 families and reinterred elsewhere. During the progress of the excavations, it was found that a line of buried tombs extended from a point near the entrance of the common to the southwest corner to a point nearly opposite to the old public library. Some of these tombs had been almost entirely destroyed, while others were in fair or good condition. If you've read history of the period, a lot of times people, criminal people, went into the graveyards and dug up the contents to take away any jewelry or anything they could possibly take. And there was a story I've read about the trouble in Boston doing that. So that's what he was worried about here. Nearly all contained coffins which for the most part were so decayed that they could not be handled, and the enclosed bones were much decomposed. In many instances, the brick arches that often served at the top of tombs had been broken in, and the tombs themselves partially filled with earth, bones, stone, or other matter, and then covered with granite slabs. So confused with the contents that it was impossible to find out the number of original interments. It was evident that such tombs had been used for the reception of bones that had been disturbed in the surrounding ground when the mall was built. Green reported that at least 90 bodies were found in 7 tombs which had not previously been disturbed, and 820 bodies were found scattered around the ground, resulting in a total of 910 bodies. Some of the coffins and tombs were still intact and had legible inscriptions of the names and dates of the people buried there. And they have a list of 24 identical names, mostly people about 50 years old. According to Green's report, the remains were given to Lewis Jones's son, an undertaker, for reburial in the Central Street burying ground. The undertakers chose a spot where the remains could be buried in a row by themselves without disturbing any of the other graves around them, and a plaque was placed above the remains which read, "Here were interned the remains of persons found under the Boylston Street Mall during the digging of the subway in 1895. A few years later, on March 4th, 1897, another much bigger problem occurred. Just as the subway construction was nearing completion, a large gas explosion occurred at the corner of Boylston and Tremont Streets after a break in an old gas main on the Boylston Street wafted into the air above and filled the large subway tunnel below. It shows one of the head houses right there where the train is coming through. Although the gas had been leaking for months and complaints had been made to the gas companies far back as December, the source of the leak was never found or repaired. Then on March 4th, 1897, 11:45 a.m., spark from the wheels of a trolley turning the corner at Tremont Street ignited the gas, set off a large explosion that killed 10 people, seriously injured 60 others, and caused extensive damages to nearby buildings. Despite the accidents, the subway construction still went ahead as scheduled, and it was completed by the end of the summer. There was another more massive problem later on as the Boston subway system and transit system was built. In 1916, a packed trolley ran into the Fort Point Channel, and it killed 46 people. They drowned in the channel itself. That was the worst of the Boston subway problems. The initial construction of the Boston subway included 3 stations: Park Street, Public Garden, and Boylston. The subway line was built a little over half a mile long and was a 3-minute ride. The underground stations were connected to trolley tracks on the city streets and later to elevated tracks above the city streets. The 2-track subway system line between Park and Tremont Street and the 4-track subway line between Boylston Street and Park Street were finished in the summer of 1897 and opened to the public on September 1st, 1897. A 4-track triangle-shaped subway line from Pleasant Street to Boston Street, and a 4-track subway line from Tremont Street to Hollis Street, and a 2-way subway track from Hollis Street to Boylston Street was completed shortly after and opened on September 30th, 1897. Construction on Charlestown Bridge began in 1896 and was opened to the public on October 27th, 1899. Additions were added to the Boston subway after initial construction was completed. In 1901, construction began on the East Boston Tunnel, which is now the Blue Line. The tunnel ran under Boston Harbor, making it the first North American tunnel to run under a body of water. The tunnel opened on December 30th, 1904. According to testimony given by President of the Boston Elevated Railway Company, Major General William A. Bancroft, to members of Parliament in 1903, that's over in England again, the subway only had a moderate effect on reducing street traffic in the congested areas and may have actually increased foot traffic. I think there is some difference in the nature of traffic, but has not had much effect in reducing congestion. The congestion in the streets by trolley cars has all been removed. The general condition is somewhat better since the construction of the subway. I think you can get on faster on Tremont Street than ever. The vehicular traffic is considerably less. I think the sidewalks are more crowded. The street is not so much. I think there is a consequent increase of pedestrian congestion at times. The number of people who travel now by the subway, where they came to the subway stations, many of them came into town by steam railroads years ago. In addition, Bancroft felt the elevated railway was much faster and more efficient mode of transportation than the underground subway itself. We carry them so much faster on the elevated road than on the subway. This Boston town bears out the tradition that the streets were marked by cows. They are so very crooked. When the Boston Transit Commission undertook the construction of the subway, in order to build the thing economically, they followed the line of the streets. They are so crooked that you cannot run trains fast in the subway. In the 6 miles of road over which our elevated trains run, only 1.5 miles is in subway. And with but 2 or 3 sharp curves, a train turns around 9 times. In other words, there are something over 3,000 degrees of curvature in many grades, some of them 5%. The elevated road runs on the structures outside the congested district, and when it reaches a constrictive district, it runs down into the subway. The subway curves, and the grades are all in subway and very noticed. The initial Boston subway construction cost taxpayers a total of $5 billion. To be specific, according to Crocker in his testimony to Parliament, the first tunnels cost a little over $4 million, altering the subway to adapt and connect to the elevated railways, which were completed in 1901. Later cost $250,000, and the East Tunnel later cost $3 million.
The Metropolitan Transit Authority, better known as the MTA, is attempting to levy a burdensome tax on the population in the form of a subway fare increase. Citizens, hear me out. This could happen to you.
Well, let me tell you of the story of a man named Charlie on that tragic and fateful day. He put 10 cents in his pocket. His wife and family went to ride on the MBTA. But did he ever return? No, he never returned. And he lived still unlearned. What a pity. He'd be riding forever beneath the streets of Boston. He's a man who never returned. Charlie handed in his dime at the Kendall Square station, and he changed for Jamaica Plain. When he got there, the conductor told him, "One more nickel, Charlie, get off of that train." Well, did he ever return? No, he never returned. And his name is still unlearned. Poor old Charlie. He may ride forever beneath the streets of Boston. He's the man who never returned. Charlie's wife goes down to Scully Square station every day at 2:15. And through the open window she hands Charlie a sandwich as the train comes rumbling. But did he ever return? No, he never returned. And his fate is still unlearned. Just like Florida. He may ride forever beneath the streets of Boston. He's the man who never returned. Take it out higher. The scandal, how we'll have to pay and pay. Yeah! Fight the fair and free. Vote for Charlie O'Brien. Yes, we're Georgie off the MBTA. Boston never returned. No, he'll never return. And his fate will be unlearned. He may ride forever, but he's the streets of Boston. He's the man who never returned. He's the man who never returned. He's the man who never returned.
That was put together because at that point, they update in the middle of the day, they updated the cost in the subway in the city of Boston from 10 cents, which it was, and they added a nickel to it in the middle of it. So the idea of the song was the idea that Charlie didn't have a nickel in his pocket to be able to throw in to escape from the subway. So he was forced to live in the subway forever. There's another interesting book, I don't know if you can get a copy of it, called Change at Parkway Street Under, written by Cudahy, and it also goes into the distribution or the construction of the subway itself.